First off, I want to say thank you to Jeff for inviting me to be here today. It's a great honor. Thank you to all the other panelists and speakers for joining this one. I think this is going to be a great session, and I look forward to hearing what other people have to say. So today I'm going to plan on talking to you about measuring awe in the moment. So this is a lot of research I was doing when I was doing my dissertation work. And this is the journey that we went on to trying to create a new measure for measuring awe. A new way of trying to get it where we can measure it in the moment instead of elsewise. And I'll get into that. All right, so if we just kind of start off and, we've got to start off with the stereotypical kind of quote. I think that this is a kind of a good one. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer wonder or stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead, a snuffed out candle. And I think this is just an interesting way that Albert Einstein has kind of put this kind of emotion out there. But when we start thinking about awe in itself, right, we have to think about where awe comes from, right? So awe comes from this old English word of egg, or the old Norse word for agi, which means terror and dread and awe. So this is where that awe comes from. And we can see, we get the sense with tornadoes, this sense of terror that comes from it, right? If we go the Webster Dictionary route, we know that the definition for awe is a feeling of respect or reverence mixed with dread and wonder, often inspired by something majestic or powerful, right? And so this is, the Yosemite Valley, and we can see this majesticness of this, how it was created and this kind of stuff, and it brings awe into our kind of understanding. If we go a little bit broader, right, and we start thinking philosophically about this, right, we know philosophy has brought this up, referring to this as the sublime, which is kind of coincides with awe. But the sublime is this wonder or fear that one experiences to something that overwhelms our existential understanding. Right? We know that Burke has wrote about how natural events such as thunderstorms instill fear, and this fear leads to sublime because it helps us acknowledge how short life can be, and that this is an awe experience in itself. And then building off of that, we know that Kant talked about how, and this gets to what Jeff had just mentioned beforehand, how there's the beauty in everyday life that leads to these awe experiences. And so you can just everyday things that you see in life can help instill awe in you. Now, if we go the religious route, we see that, awe can be, is expressed through this beauty and this fear of God, or this fear of an omnipotent being, and how their creation of the world is where the awe comes in. And now this makes one realize their own size in the world or in the universe when they start thinking about this. And it's not just individuals that are religious, right? We can see that spiritual and religious individuals say that there is something greater than us in the universe, and that it's this that leads to that feeling of awe of not knowing what's out there. Now, if we bring this full scope and we start bringing this into the psychological kind of view, right? We heard from Dr. Keltner on Monday, where his seminal paper with Haidt talks about vastness and need for accommodation, right? We know that this vastness is, those are the two things, that make up awe. And that vastness is often this matter of simple physical size, but it can also be this social size, such as fame, authority, or prestige. And that this need for accommodation is this process of adjusting one's mental structures or schemas that cannot assimilate to new experiences, right? So we all have an idea or a schema of what a tree is, but when you go to the Sequoia National Forest in California for the first time and you see a Sequoia redwood, you get to understand, well, this isn't the tree that I have in my front yard. This is an enormous tree. Now I have to adjust my understanding of what a tree is, and that's an awe experience in itself. And we also heard from Dr. Chiodo yesterday, where we know that these awe experiences help elicit these kind of increased heart rates or neurological differences, and these kind of things are all part of what's going on when we experience awe. Now, if we bring this all together, right, so taking all this philosophical, this religion, this psychological kind of things into consideration, when we were on this path of trying to create this new kind of measure, we thought that their awe seemed to be made up of 4 or 5 different dimensions, right? So we got the sense that awe is very positive, but it's also negative, right? There is this fear that is associated with awe, right? There is this self-diminishment where you feel small, and then there's this perceived vastness where things seem large. But then there's also this overwhelming sensations or perceptions. Again, your heart starts racing. So we got all these kind of thoughts. We thought that all these dimensions were important to awe. So it made us want to look at and see how was awe currently being measured, and how was it being measured in the time. And so we started looking at some of these different ways that awe was measured. Right, one of the most popular ways that we can know is using the dispositional positive emotion scale, specifically the awe subscale of that. I refer to it as the DPAS awe. I don't know if that's how Shioda would prefer it to be known, but that's what I call it. But this DPAS awe, right, is this 6-item scale that asks questions such as, I often feel awe, or I feel wonder almost every day. But one of the downsides of this scale is that it measures your dispositional amount of awe. It measures your inherent amount of awe. So theoretically, you shouldn't see differences depending on your changes because you can only have a certain inherent amount of awe. And so that's something that might be a downside for this measure. Another one is the small self measure. Now, this is a 10-item scale that follows this vastness need for accommodation put forward by Keltner, and asks questions like, I feel like I am in the presence of something grand. Now, this is an interesting kind of scale in itself. Now, whether or not it's valid in its methodologicals, it's kind of hard to say. They refer to it as a single dimension item, but then they use it as multi-dimension. But one of the things that's missing from this is that negative or that dark awe, that fear that is built. So that's something that, if you use this kind of measure, you're missing out on that aspect. And one of the more recent kind of scales that came out is the awe experience scale from Yaden, who just gave a talk in this previous session, which is a 6-factor measure of awe that covers areas like time and self-loss and accommodation, with questions like, I felt that I was in the presence of greatness. Now, this is a very new kind of measure, and I will be upfront and say that we were working on our scales at the same time. So I don't know a lot about this scale as much, but there is this aspect that this dark awe is still kind of missing from this scale. And so it's thinking of all these different kind of concepts that led us to want to try to investigate, okay, what can we do to try to make sure that all these different dimensions are covered? And so what we did is we tried to create a new scale by presenting questions or by presenting words to individuals after they thought about an experience. And so first thing we had people do, across 2 different studies, we asked participants to just describe as vividly as possible a time when you felt awe. What triggered it? What were you doing? Where were you? Who were you with? And so forth. And so we wanted them to relive this kind of experience. And so some of the responses that we got were looking at the night sky as a child, realizing incomprehensible vastness by myself. Right, so this is interesting. We're already seeing this small self. We're realizing how vast the world is. Somebody wrote about when they experienced awe. Another one was, I was at the art museum and just thinking about the people that came before me and how they were able to figure out how to create depth. Again, it's this small self, this sense of thinking of your own self in the world is bringing up this awe experience. But then there was also, I would have to say that I felt awe when the Boston Marathon bombings occurred. Right, this type of awe for me was not wonder or amazement, but fear and dread. Right, we're seeing that these negative kind of things can also be awe-inducing. Another response was seeing the 9/11 attacks. Right, these are horrible things that occurred, but they are awe experiences because it makes you have to readjust for what's going on. Now, after people wrote about these relived experiences, we had them rate how central or important some words or phrases were to that relived experience. Now, I don't want to bore anybody with too many numbers and too many graphs and all this kind of stuff. I'll just say that what we end up coming up with was what we refer to as the situational awe scale. And it's made up these 4 different factors, right? So we have this factor called connection, which is words like, or phrases like, I felt a closer sense of my identity or who I am. This oppression, I felt confined, I felt tense. Chills, my heart was racing, my breath was taken away. Or this diminished self, I felt physically smaller or trivial in the grand scheme of things. All these things came out to be related to people's experiences with awe. Now, when we looked at this and we did this all in the lab, right, our situational awe scale appropriately correlated with the DPAS awe and the small self. That's what we wanted. That's convergent validity. That shows that what we were measuring was the same as theirs. But the difference was that ours showed situational differences in the lab where those scales did not. So when we used our scale in an experiment where we showed people either a positive video or neutral video or a negative video or a neutral video, the DPAS awe and the small self awe wasn't able to show a difference between those. Nobody had a differences in the amount of dispositional awe that they had if they saw positive or negative or neutral video. But in the situational awe scale, we saw those differences. Those differences came through because we were measuring in different ways. And this led us to want to try to see, how else could we do this? So we decided we wanted to take the SAS out into the wild, right? So we took the situational awe scale into the wild. And what we did is we teamed up with some great researchers at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. And we decided that we were going to measure individuals' awe while they were experiencing a couple different areas in the museum. So we tested people in 3 different areas. The first area, or one of 3 areas, I should say. The first area that we tested people at was what is the rotunda of the MSI, right? And so the rotunda is the center of the museum, and it gives off this sense of vastness from one taking the escalator up from the lower floor and viewing the height of the rotunda as they're coming up. So you come up this escalator right down the bottom and you enter this vast, beautiful building of marble and what it is, and you feel your sense of smallness as you walk in there. So that was this one area we thought would be very awe-inducing. The second area that we thought would be the German U-505 exhibit that puts you face to face with an authentic German U-boat from World War II. And it has you walk all the way around from bow to stern of the boat. And as you're walking around, you can see what the war did to this boat, and you could see the experience of this. And so while both of these areas induced senses of vastness, right, the way we thought awe would be felt was different, right? For instance, we thought for the rotunda, awe would be felt in this kind of aesthetic beauty, in this kind of positive way. But we thought that awe would be felt in the U-505 would come more from this history behind the World War II and the capturing of the U-boat. And as you're walking around, you see bullet holes in the U-boat. So you can see what this is and you get that negative sense. And so we thought that these would be different experiences. And just as for information, our third area that we did for this analysis was the garage. We tested the parking garage and how much awe people experienced in the parking garage. We just, that's a good kind of control. Now, when we measured the DPAS in these 3 different areas, we saw that individuals didn't differ in their amount of awe that they experienced between the garage, the rotunda, and U-505, which again makes sense. If the DPAS measures your dispositional amount of awe, it doesn't matter what you're experiencing, you're going to have the same amount of awe in every area. However, when we use the SAS in these different areas, we see that the SAS in the rotunda, right, makes a stronger connection than the garage. We see connection comes out more in the rotunda than it did in the garage. We see that chills, people have more awe associated with chills in the rotunda than they did the garage. And we see in terms of the U-505, people have this stronger sense of connection, again, to the U-505 than they did before. So again, this felt this closer sense of who I am, my own identity. Now I'm just going to go ahead and finish up here. Summarizing, understanding this experience of awe through a measure can be dependent on the type of measure that's being used, right? If you use a certain type of measure, you may be missing out on other things. And so it's important to understand what you want to understand about awe to know what kind of measure to use. And lastly, I'll say awe is an emotion that's made up of many different facets. Not only helps us make sense of the world around us, but also allows us to become stronger from those experiences that we do not or cannot understand. I just want to thank my mentor and advisor, Kimberly Quinn, for helping me with all this research and doing a lot. Sheila Crodesperson, who's also presenting in panel 6 today, who's going to be presenting on awe and environments, and Museum of Science and Industry. Thank you for all their work. Now, I don't know how quickly I ended, so hopefully that's on time. And I will hand it back to Jeff.
It was perfect. Well done. Thank you.
So one of life's biggest questions is, what is the meaning of life? Or more specifically, what is the meaning of my life? Or what is the meaning of our life? As humans, we need to make meaning of our experiences. We need to know that our lives are meaningful. We also need to know why we are here and what life and our existence is all about. So to start my talk, I do want to share a quote by the existential psychotherapist, Irvin Yalom. A sense of life meaning ensues, but cannot be deliberately pursued. Life meaning is always a derivative phenomenon that materializes when we have transcended ourselves, when we have forgotten ourselves and become absorbed in someone or something outside of ourselves. So what Yalom's essentially describing here is awe. If we think about the psychological definition of awe, awe is perceptual vastness followed by a need of accommodation. So we encounter a vast and novel stimulus that is just outside of our frame of reference, which then prompts us to change our perspective of the world. And in that process, we transcend ourselves and experience the world in a relatively new way. So before I get into how awe ties into the meaning of life, I do want to highlight some of the outcomes of positive awe experiences. So we know that 1, awe promotes spirituality and self-transcendence. So various research studies have shown that awe can make us feel connected to other people and the world around us. These experiences in turn can provide us with a sense of meaning in life. 2, awe promotes feelings of the small self. So awe allows people to become less self-focused and more other-focused. In other words, awe allows people to surrender to the human experience and return to the greater whole and feel more at one with humanity. 3rd, awe promotes life satisfaction and positive mood, both which I will talk about later. Both of these outcomes are associated with the meaning of life, so people who report that their lives are meaningful are also more likely to report positive moods and satisfaction with life. So what does the research tell us? So to date, there are not many studies on awe and the meaning of life. One group of researchers did examine the effects of awe and meaning in life across several studies. They asked participants to watch one of 2 clips, either an awe-inducing planet Earth clip or a neutral clip, and they found that people who watched the awe-inducing clip reported meaning in life through feelings of happiness and the small self. So what this means is that after participants watched the awe-inducing clip, they felt awe, which led them to feelings of happiness in the small self, which led them to feel a sense of meaning. So in my work, I wanted to understand the association between awe and meaning in life a little bit better. So we looked at individual differences, such as dispositional awe or awe proneness in participants. So dispositional awe refers to those people who are naturally more prone to feeling awe. A person with dispositional awe could perhaps feel just as much awe watching raindrops hit the ground as they would visiting the Grand Canyon. So in our study, we used the same awe-inducing planet Earth clip and neutral clip that Rivera and colleagues used in their study. We looked at awe and various outcome variables while taking into account people's dispositional awe. Now, I do want to note that the findings I'm about to show you are taken from my undergraduate work, which is based on a single sample and study. So we can't actually draw conclusions about a population just yet. But I do think that these findings are interesting and can give us insight into awe, meaning, and more. So we found that people with dispositional awe were obviously more responsive to the awe-inducing stimuli. So the planet Earth clip that they watched. Dispositional awe predicted presence of meaning and search for meaning. So what this means is that people with dispositional awe will feel a sense of meaning with or without the awe-inducing clip that they watched. Dispositional awe and the awe-inducing clip together predicted positive mood. So that is, people with dispositional awe who watched the awe-inducing clip experienced more positive mood. And what this means is that positive mood might be slightly lower in people with dispositional awe if they are not presented with awe-eliciting stimuli or prompted to feel awe. Dispositional awe and the awe-inducing clip itself predicted negative mood. So not only did people with dispositional awe report decreases in negative mood after watching the awe-inducing clip, but the awe-inducing clip also decreased negative mood in those without the disposition. So we know that the awe-inducing clip was effective. And people with dispositional awe are also more likely to feel satisfied with life overall. So what all of this research tells us is that 1, awe can lead people to feel that their lives are meaningful in the present through feelings of the small self. And 2, people who naturally feel more awe are more likely to report greater meaning in life, which suggests that awe may actually predispose people to meaning. People with dispositional awe are also more likely to experience positive outcomes that are related to meaning in life, such as positive mood and life satisfaction. Now, of course, this is not to say that you are doomed if you are not awe-prone, but it is to say that people who are awe-prone have a slight advantage when it comes to accessing meaning in life and other positive outcomes. So why is this research important and why should we care about it? Well, this research has shown that meaning in life is associated with an array of positive outcomes. So for example, people with a sense of meaning report a greater sense of well-being. They also live longer. Our sense of meaning can literally affects our physical health. In adolescence in particular, meaning is a protective factor against poor risk factors and poor psychological health. Next, awe may be the key to meaning. It allows people to access and see the bigger picture. It may remind people that what they do matters. So if we think about it this way, the ongoing pandemic has been stressful and challenging for all of us. First responders and those working on the front line especially may feel that they're carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders because the world relies on them. I think like when you're in these roles, you may feel that sometimes your actions and efforts are insignificant because the problem, that being the pandemic, is just so big and complex and beyond your control, that there's only so much that you can do and that there are only so many resources that are available to you. So I think awe can be very useful in the sense to as an emotion to experience from time to time. It may very well be a way we can cultivate meaning in our lives. It may remind us that what we do does matter. It may remind us why we entered our line of work in the first place, because awe takes us back to the bigger picture, which leads me to the third point. So as you all know by now, awe is associated with many positive outcomes. Our research shows that people experience immediate benefits, such as in mood, after watching an awe-inspiring clip. It also shows that awe at an individual level plays some role in existential and psychological well-being. Other research has shown that people can access meaning through the small self after watching an awe-inducing clip. So indeed, meaning in life is not only an existential concern, but it is also an existential need. And awe may just be one of the fastest ways to meeting that need. So I just wanted to quickly share some ways we can seek awesome experiences. Nature, in my opinion, is the best way to access awe. I personally find looking up at trees to be awe eliciting, sunsets, sunlight, you name it. But it's not always easy to access these natural environments or hiking trails, parks, beaches, etc. So that said, I also want to share some ways we can seek the awesome in everyday life. I really do think that awesome experiences are all around us, and those experiences will look different for everyone. So here are just some ideas. It could be, looking at different forms of art. It could be sitting in front of your fireplace and watching the wood burn, going to a concert or listening to music. Obviously, that's not possible during the pandemic, but streaming live concerts online is an option. Astronomy is a great way to feel awe. NASA has tons of videos and images that are available to the public. I also highly recommend that you look up Carl Sagan's narration of the pale blue dot, which you can find on YouTube. It's definitely worth the watch. Paying attention to different textures, paying attention to raindrops on the window, paying attention to the water that comes out of a faucet or tap. Or how about the next time you're out and about, you could take a moment and look up at a tall building or structure. It just goes to show that we don't necessarily need to travel or go to the Grand Canyon to experience awe. Awe experiences are not so much about where you look, but what you see. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, all of it was fantastic. It truly was. And it was such a great down-to-earth way to share really substantial scientific evidence and data. So thank you for that. And just those last bits at the end, I just wanted to point out, that's for everybody, where I always say, especially with the resilience work that I do and connecting it to this with the awe, you get what you put into it. And especially what Susan and Bill have already shared as well, it's like, if you stand there saying you don't get it, please challenge yourself a little bit more, because especially what Susan just added, those are those awe moments that are there. And as I might have said yesterday, and I say a lot in my talks and trainings, this is not soft or touchy-feely type stuff. And keep in mind, I'm 18 years in the NYPD. I'm a former hostage negotiator, taught and trained literally all over this world, specialized units, special ops, doctors, ER rooms. This is the stuff that helps us be better at what we do for a living. But also, let's stop for a moment on that. We're not law enforcement. We're not first responders, frontline workers 24/7. We're also human beings. And that's why this truly is for everybody here to realize it truly is those little moments. And I hope I was challenging myself thinking this stuff as you were showing those photos, Susan, looking at a building and with a group that I worked with yesterday, saying, even as an exercise, find a building that you walk by perhaps every single day and look at it differently. And the example somebody gave me was find the year the building was made and just take a moment to think about what the hell it was like that year they were building it. And even if it was 2 years ago, 20 years ago, 50, 60, those are the things that, as you said, it helps us and we all can use it. And so thank you very much. Let's move on next to our next speaker. And then after our speaker, we'll get to hearing some comments from our panelists. So Daniel, Daniel is a PhD candidate at the Center for Science Communication from the University of Otago. If anybody is wondering where that is, it's in the wonderful country of New Zealand. And I especially thank Daniel slightly a little bit more than everybody else, because Daniel it's somewhere in the middle of the night for him. So thank you. What is it, 2 or 3 a.m.? Something like that, I'm sure. Whatever it is, hopefully he's loaded on coffee. I'm going to turn it over to you, because he's going to now talk to us about the cultural varieties of awe in the case of science communication. It ties into some really interesting work in the paper that he had published. So Daniel, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone. Cool. Kia ora, greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. My name is Daniel Silva Luna. I'm a PhD candidate at the Center for Science Communication at the University of Otago. Again, thank you for inviting me to talk about my PhD research on the varieties of awe in science communication. And having studied awe over the last 3 years for my PhD, people now come to me and ask me, like, what is awe? And my current response to their question is, whose awe are you talking about? Is it the celebratory awe of the basketball fan watching their favorite player lead their team to victory? Is it the expansive awe of a religious individual transfixing the meanings and symbols of a religious ceremony? Is it the melancholic awe of an environmentalist mourning the scale of the devastation we have brought upon the oceans? Or is it the quotidian awe of a pedestrian who marvels at the monotony of ordinary life? We argue that depending on whose awe you're talking about, this emotion is going to be a very different thing. So last year, we published an article titled The Construction of Awe in Science Communication in the Journal of Public Understanding of Science. In this article, we argued, among other things, that there is a convergence in a lot of the literature and emotion from psychology, neuroscience, sociology, anthropology, cultural studies, and history around the idea that emotions are sociocultural constructs, meaning that people's emotions are not innate, but rather they learn their emotions from the context they navigate from birth. And this applies to all emotions, including happiness, sadness, fear, and in our case, awe. As one of the most important researchers on emotions, Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett, author of How Emotions Are Made, argues infants show no evidence of being born knowing awe. This means that people don't carry some sort of awe program in their head that things in the world just activate, but rather we argue that awe is a skill. And as a skill, it is learned and can be developed. I like to think of this as a skill such as driving a car. Nobody's born knowing how to drive, but most people in industrialized countries learn to drive a car. Similarly, English speakers learn a general gist of awe from the broader culture. However, and going back to my analogy, there are many different kinds of specialized vehicles that many people don't normally drive, and knowing how to drive a car doesn't necessarily translate to knowing how to drive these vehicles. Some of these may be closer to driving a car, so you don't have to start from scratch, but some of these are different activities altogether, so you have to learn and develop the skills to drive these other types of vehicles. So as there are many types of vehicles that require learning for driving, we argue that there are many different types of awe out there that require cultivation and practice for you to become skilled at these. And where do you get to practice these other types of awe? So another thing we argue is different cultures have different types of awe, whether it's the sports world, the world of art, wellness culture, certain religious communities, existentialists, philosophers, humanists, psychologists, hate groups, environmentalists, the tourism industry, and many others. They have their own versions of awe. One place where you can find a lot of expressions of awe is in science communication. So I study science communication. That is, I study how regular folks make sense out of science. I also study the practices and products made by science communicators. This includes everything from science museums and festivals, science documentaries and YouTube videos, science tweets, science street art. So mostly anything sciencey outside the classroom in academia, that's what I study. And during my study, I noticed that many famous science communicators love to talk about awe and wonder. So Rachel Carson talks about the wonders of nature. Richard Feynman talked about the awe he gets from physics. Neil deGrasse Tyson talks about the awe-like feelings he finds in astronomy and cosmology. However, I also noticed that they were using very different language to describe these emotions. Contemplation, beauty, humility, excitement, mystery, spiritual reaction, majesty. These words mean different things. So I wondered why do science communicators refer to awe using such variety of language. So as part of my research, I went out and had in-depth interviews with science communicators trying to answer the question, how do science communicators talk about awe? So I talked to 22 practicing science communicators in different countries who practice science communication in English and asked them about awe, how they experience it, how they use it, what they think about it. I analyzed the interviews looking for common themes, and I found that science communication has many types of awe. There's no one, but at least 9 different types of awe. That was what I found. I also found that these different types of awe result from people having different beliefs and values. So for example, the belief that science is fun and it should be available for everyone is accompanied by versions of awe around the goal of entertainment. So an explosion, a surprising fact, a creepy crawler, awe is there for people to enjoy and be entertained. Another example that I found comes with the belief that in modern life, people are alienated and disengaged from their environment, but also comes with the idea that awe is something that can be easily found in the picturesque, in the mundane, in the beautiful encounters with nature. This then comes with versions of awe through science, which foster a sense of connection. Another version of awe comes with the belief that science is inherently awe-inspiring, but also defines science as hard and something reserved only for experts. This comes with description of awe in science communication as something that should inspire admiration and devotion towards science and reverence towards scientists and their products. Finally, the belief that science could replace religion, together with ideas of awe as a summit of some sort of emotion mountain, as something that is very difficult to achieve. Describe awe in science communication using somewhat spiritual vocabulary that can be cataloged as transcendent. I also observed some major themes around curiosity and humility, and some minor ones around futurism, melancholia, and national pride. So to conclude, what does this mean? If awe is a skill and there are many versions of awe out there, means that awe is a choice. You can cultivate this emotion by participating in the many spaces that foster the varieties of this experience and practice these varieties in these spaces. This also means, however, that as with every choice, awe is both ethical and political. Because whether you choose versions of awe which are elitist and hierarchical, or you choose versions of awe that are participatory and democratic, whichever type of awe you choose to practice and cultivate, you will be reinforcing the beliefs and the values that come with each of these versions, and this will have an impact in both you, those around you, and the society you're helping to create. So my question to you is, what type of awe do you practice? Thank you. And thanks again, Jeff.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Daniel. And especially, it truly is thought-provoking in the way with your questions of what types of awe do you practice and how it reinforces your value. Yet, and hopefully it challenges people to thinking how awe is almost a choice in the sense, do you allow yourself the opportunity to experience in it? And then also, as you mentioned, if it's reinforcing values, are you then also exposing yourself to different types of awe, to be open then to different perspectives too, which we've heard. Fantastic. But those are my thoughts. I'm just speaking out loud. More importantly, I want to hear from our panelists that I'm grateful for them to have joined us here. Let's first jump in. Again, I recommend everybody please look at their bios. I won't go through it, but first I'd like to turn it to David. David Marshall is a superintendent with the British Transport Police over in the UK, United Kingdom. He's also importantly the chair of the National Police Suicide Prevention Group, and that's how I believe we first connected. And I guess if you don't mind, can you just share a bit of your perspective from a personal mindset, but also what you do for a living? And then please, by all means, send a question to one of our presenters. All yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeff, and thanks everyone. Some incredibly thought-provoking presentations. So from my perspective and my background, 28 years as a police officer, only in the last few years have I become very heavily involved in police wellbeing, and particularly around suicide prevention within policing. So I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here and join colleagues today. I think it's an amazing event, and well done for putting it together. So the question, I suppose, is to Dr. Krenzer. William, really excellent presentation, very, very thought-provoking. I was very interested in your discussion around dark awe and the measurement scale that you described. So I suppose that dark awe, that fear and dread, and I'm thinking about police practice, law enforcement experience in particular. And do you think that the measurement scale that you've devised through the research can be adapted or applied to measure awe within occupational specific contexts? So I'm thinking obviously about first responders, police officers, to really understand how that particular occupational population experience awe, but particularly what you describe as dark awe.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, David. Thank you. And I think I would say the short answer would be yes. I think that it could, but I think that there's a caveat to it in that it would really depend on what's the situation that you're trying to measure, right? So I don't know if you'd get a lot out of the situational awe scale, the SAS, if you measure first responders on like an everyday basis, like, hey, how was your day? I think, maybe after an incident that they maybe were involved in, maybe then you could get it to see if that kind of oppression kind of felt, if they felt confined, that dark awe picked up a little bit. But I think if it's, again, not a police officer, not a first responder, so I can't speak for that. But I think if it's just an everyday kind of thing, I don't think you would see that kind of difference that you would see compared to if it was being involved in a shooting, being involved in a robbery, something that's larger scale than what it may be. I think that that's what it could be. And to your work, it might just be interesting to see if somebody does have that kind of issue, does how they rate on some of that dark awe, that oppressive aspect of awe, does that lead to correlations in other things that may lead to depression, that may lead to thoughts of suicide, that could be better to catch that earlier on. So if someone is involved in a big shooting, you give them the scale, and maybe we find out that is highly correlated with down the road needing extra help, then we can get that earlier on and make sure that they can get that help. And then not to keep talking, because I know there's other great questions that are going out there, but this may also be an interesting thing to think about of how can we better support police in terms of this kind of issues when things happen. Is there things like scales that we can give them that we can try to catch some of these things? So, does your amount of dispositional awe affect how you are resilient in the long run, or how you experience these different things? Do individuals who have high amounts of awe, do they not get bothered by these shootings as much, or is it the reverse? I think that those are interesting questions. And Susan, I know you were talking about dispositional awe a lot more than I was, so I'm not trying to take any time from you, but I think that that's an interesting thing that we can kind of look at as well.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great points. And I know, David, I know you're starting your PhD journey. So it sounds like there's a lot of potential research topics for you and a lot of people to collaborate if you so choose.
Indeed. Indeed. Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. And thanks, William. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Krenzer. Let's move next to, I'd love to hear from Dr. Catherine Goodwin. She's a clinical psychologist and assistant director of inclusion, culture, and well-being for the Welsh Ambulance Services over in the UK. And again, it's not just police, first responders, also frontline workers, and your work involves a bit of all that. So I'd love to hear your take, and please send a question to one of our experts.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Yeah, it was wonderful to hear your presentation, Susan. I think it's I love the concept of the small self and the impact that has on increasing our connections. As you all know, people who work in frontline services often have difficulty accessing help, asking for help, because I think they're always the people that people turn to when they want help. So thinking about how we can support them in feeling more connected, which we know increases resilience within teams and with organisations, and this feels like a really accessible way of doing that, particularly with people who often enjoy being outside doing awe-inspiring things. So I guess my question really is about how does this work with people who've experienced, and I guess it sort of reflects on some of the things you've been saying, William, on people who've had negative experience of awe. If you're trying to inspire awe in people who have experienced trauma, are you aware of any research that's looking at that, or is going to be looking at that in first responders of any type?
So I'm not quite sure, but I think that's definitely something researchers can look into in the future. I think we're finally just starting to realize how complex awe actually is, the different layers to the different emotions, and how it's not only associated with positive outcomes, but how it could also help people perhaps who are struggling with their mental health, like psychopathology, that sort of thing. And I think perhaps maybe finding out whether or not we can actually develop the attentional resources to access all experiences. I think that could be very beneficial to people. So that could, look like daily exercises people could do, mindfulness practices, that sort of thing. But yeah, I'm really not aware of what research is out there. But I do think that it's kind of just the beginning for that line of research, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like there's lots of opportunities. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Susan. As a reminder, just if people are interested in a lot more of just the overall vastness of the research on Awe, I'll put the link in the box. But what we did is we put up on the Resilience Symposium as many studies as we can find, and we're still adding more to it. But I think there's already probably 20 to 30 listed there for people to go down that rabbit hole and come back up hours later. Enjoy it, because that's why we put it there. Next, I want to jump to our other expert panelist, Amy. Amy, the work you're doing is fantastic in policing and mental health, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. And so Amy's a constable project manager. She's with the Breakthrough Wellness team at the York Regional Police, just north of us, up in Canada. And honestly, with everything that you're involved in law enforcement, but also mental health and wellness for first responders, I'd love to get your perspective, and then please ask a question to one of our speakers.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And really enjoying these presentations. Super fascinated by all of this research. I really enjoyed the fact that you were saying that different cultures have different types of awe. So it's been well referenced that organization climate often determines what behaviors are appropriate and therefore likely to be used by police when dealing with a stressful or emotionally charged situation. It's also been referenced that police culture inhibits expression of emotion. I just want to bring up, there was another research study that I had read from the Australian psychologist on being mindful, emotionally aware, and more resilient. It was a longitudinal study that they did on police recruits. And what they found was that maladaptive coping, so especially avoidance, was socialized among a sample of recruit training. So they found that police officers became more emotionally detached or hardened within the first 18 months of police service. So they're at greater risk of becoming unsentimental, detached, cynical, or blocking out emotions. So while blocking emotions or detaching from emotions is potentially protective when you're in a crisis moment, the thing is we come back and then we have our workplace interactions, personal relationships, and also while we're engaging with the community, that's not beneficial. So avoiding or suppressing emotions has been linked to poor mental health. So in this particular study, they had introduced mindfulness and emotional awareness interventions through workshops, which showed that it was linked to improved mental health, well-being, and personal effectiveness. So in relationship to the research that you're talking about, how it's a skill and it's learned, it's developed, it can be cultivated. You mentioned that emotions emerge from language, memory, and affect in changing contexts through different situations throughout a person's lifetime through these repeated use of, through the use within a particular culture. You also mentioned that it can be shaped by values, norms, and different belief systems that are deemed important to that culture. So I'm just within that aspect, and thinking about how being a police officer within the context of being in a police culture, a lot of police organizations right now are looking at focusing on well-being in policing and how to improve resiliency. And some of the 3 areas they're really focusing on are police culture, mental health, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm just wondering from your research, how do we draw on these awe emotions to, so it's kind of loaded. So first is to disrupt the role of stigma and bias in preventing social inclusion, because we know that awe feelings can create that interconnectedness. The second thing is also, how would we enhance our communication around the nature of police work, because it can be super stressful and we're exposed to all these traumatic incidences. So Just want to hear your take on what we can do, not even just with the policing community, but as frontline workers, even in the healthcare system.
That's quite a lot. But,
Sorry.
But yeah, so I'm going to say something that's a little bit contrarian to a lot of the stuff that you've heard over the last day and a half. But I don't think necessarily assuming, for example, that people are going to go out in nature and experience awe is necessarily helpful. What I suggest is understanding where people are coming from. Like, people can experience awe in nature, but they can experience it in a variety of contexts, and meeting them in their own terms, meeting them knowing, kind of understanding where they're coming from, what are their beliefs, what are their values, what are their histories, what are their interests. If you have someone that's a religious individual, well, go to church with them and cultivate that awe in their religious rituals and work with that. If you got someone that is into comic books or gaming, try to find ways to cultivate the like good emotions through those activities, going to comic conventions, going to organizing a comic book club, or like that kind of stuff. So thinking in terms of where people are and where they can cultivate their emotions, considering where they are, I think it's kind of the first step towards getting people to cultivate those emotions and cultivate positive emotions in that sense. So yeah, that's kind of my couple cents of that I can contribute to this conversation, is trying to think more holistically and not just like assume from the start that, oh, we just take them out of nature and the nature walk, because that doesn't necessarily work for everyone. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Daniel. And I think the only thing I'll add to that I don't think it's really contrary to anything we heard. I think it's really very much in line, either way I look at it, with everything, because there is no one quick fix, especially something as toxic as some parts of police culture or any first responder or any cultures. It's very complex. And I think therefore the approach to try to counter that and remove it has to be equally, if not more complex. And everything that you even mentioned in that quick rundown of the different options aside of awe, right? Because awe won't fix everything. Like, let's be realistic, as important as it is. But you mentioned all things that are hardcore resilience, like having hobbies, spirituality and faith, and going to church if that's for you, and then going to events and that social connectedness. I'd love to open it up to anybody on here, whether it's Susan, William, Amy, or David, or even you, Catherine. Do you want to add to that? Because I think there was a lot there with what Amy said, and then her question with David's response. I'll just open it to the floor for the time we have left.
I mean, I'll just jump in, and I don't know how much this will address Amy's questions per se, but I think to get to a point that you had made earlier, Jeff, and I think to Daniel's perspective, I think, we can experience awe anywhere and in any way. And I think one of the things that I know from an issue that I have is that we become awe becomes salient around us, or it becomes in the background where we don't notice these things when we live our everyday lives, right? So the example that I can think of is, I lived in San Francisco for many years, and the Golden Gate Bridge is a huge tourist attraction, but for years that just became, oh, that's just a bridge. I don't want to go there. But then when you start thinking like, no, this is a big thing, that this is something I need to experience this the right way. I think that's the issue. I think a lot of us will live our days to our everyday lives and not think about the important things around us, or try to make moments out of what's around us. And I think that the more that we can try to do that, the better we can be. Again, that doesn't address Amy's question now that I think about it at all, but that's just something that I thought was important to say, that, Jeff, you're in New York City, the amount of beautiful architecture and the amount of beautiful things that are around there that you see every day, you lose sight of that. And unless you take a moment to yourself and you realize, okay, that is the Empire State Building, that is the World Trade Center location, like those are amazing moments that we can lose out on if we don't bring it to our consciousness.
Absolutely.
Just to your point, William, I was going to say, actually, I guess the point would be to have that pause moment, and then it's that paying attention, right? So maybe not creating the situations, but taking the time to actually experience what it is, and kind of to the point that Susan was bringing up as well.
Yeah, and I guess to Daniel's point too, it doesn't have to be architecture for everyone, right? Like it could be, if you are reading a comic book, like you said, and you're just at home, make that experience what it is and realize the work that goes into it, and try to take that time for yourself. And some of the things that are in the chat are about how can we improve this resiliency, or these issues that are rising. And maybe that's something we need to work with law enforcement, is to make sure that they take that moment away from being a law enforcement officer for 20 hours a day, and take that moment to realize, okay, hey, I need something for myself. What brings me joy? What can I turn that joy into awe, and get something out of it?
Yeah. Nicely said.
Thinking of awe, it's something that can also be experienced in little moments. It doesn't have to be this like transcendental experience that changes, like life-changing experience. It can be like a little quotidian kind of like, oh, there's a dandelion growing in the little corner in the pavement, and observe that and like be there. But sometimes we tend to like think of awe as this like super great experience that like is life transforming, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that.
Yeah, and I see in the chat box, Patricia just mentioned awe is multi-sensory. How about the smell of delicious cooking? And that's where I'd say, yeah, of course that can be awe, but I think of conversations I have with people where they say, no, that's not awe for me. I just really like doing it. Okay, then let's not get caught up on the word awe. It's just do the things you like doing. I know it's Susan. What do you think with your findings and how it ties into whether it's awe or not, but how it connects then for what people do for a living, and not just police or first responders, but giving them that sense of purpose or meaning in life?
Well, I mean, like Daniel said, awe doesn't necessarily have to be these grand experiences. I think we can experience awe in different doses. If we go to the Grand Canyon, obviously it's going to be a very transformative experience, but then there's also like awe. You could be walking to work and you could see, a leaf on the ground, and it could just be the most beautiful leaf ever. And you might feel a sense of awe in that moment. And that might just give you a sense of relief, I guess, while you go to work. I think it really comes down to how we think about awe, and kind of shifting our perspective. The idea that we can only experience awe if we, travel or go to the Grand Canyon, I think is just false. I think it's important for people to understand that, there are different types of experiences of awe, and it could be super intense, or it could just be something like something that kind of just comes and goes in our day-to-day life.